I'm not going crazy stuck inside, am I? I'm not going crazy at all. No, no. Definitely not going crazy being quarantined. Definitely not. Not.
So, as I mentioned in the other video, I wanted to take this video to talk to you a little bit about Japan before World War II and what they were up to and how they got into all of this. So first of all, as we mentioned back a few weeks now, back in the imperialism section, Japan was kind of one of the exceptions to the rule that most of these imperialist countries were European during the late 1800s. Japan was involved in the same exact kind of imperialism in Asia. They were taking over different territories, most notably Korea during that time. And a lot of their activities were very, very similar to what you would have seen in European colonies. They had this idea called the co-prosperity sphere, that they wanted all of Asia to be under one umbrella, and that is a Japanese umbrella. The problem with that is it sounded like a great idea, and they said it was for the benefit of all Asians. But the problem with that is it came with a lot of hiccups and hangups. So, first of all, the cultural impact of all of this. Japan wanted everyone to be more or less Japanese. They wanted people to adopt Japanese customs, Japanese culture. And while they did take some efforts to preserve local histories and stuff, they often would do so with a Japanese slant, often erasing some of this history of these places that they overtook. Not only that, but the Japanese did engage in forced labor like you saw in many of the European colonies in different places. And ultimately, the Japanese really just replaced European imperialism. They claimed to be better, they claimed to have nobler goals, and on paper maybe that was true, but in practice it looked very similar. It was essentially the same. So, Korea. First of all, they start getting involved in Korea around 1870 or so, and they are slowly taking over Korea. First, it's more of an indirect rule, if you remember that term, but slowly it would develop into more of a direct rule until we got all the way up to 1910, when they formally annexed Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and that would continue all the way up until they lost in World War II, and America and Russia would split the Korean Peninsula, and that's a whole other thing for another unit. In 1931, the Japanese would invade an area of modern-day China and ancient China known as Manchuria. The reason we say Manchuria and not China is because they're undergoing their own power shift, and this area is not technically China at the time, it's Manchuria. So they invade this area known as Manchuria, and the League of Nations, mentioned in the World War I video, again, their goal is to stop all future major wars. When the Japanese invade Manchuria, the League of Nations step in and say, hey, you can't do that. That's not okay. And the Japanese, for lack of, deeper explanation, go, or what? And the League of Nations doesn't have an answer for that. There's no teeth to the League of Nations. That's one of the things that would go on to be improved with the UN. The League of Nations didn't ultimately have any power. That was the power they had, was to condemn certain actions around the world and put some political pressure and maybe some economic pressure, but ultimately their powers were very, very limited in scope. And so in 1933, 2 years after this invasion began, Japan would formally withdraw from the League of Nations. They had been a member. If you remember, America was not a member. Even though we came up with the idea for creating the League of Nations, we did not join it. And that was one of the things that weakened it even further. So, they leave the League of Nations. And a few years down the line, 1937, they invade another part of modern-day China, which China at the time. So this invasion comes with starting through Shanghai, if you know where that is, and Shanghai puts up a very stiff resistance, and this is said to anger many of the Japanese soldiers, which is cited as a possible reason for what I'm about to tell you about. And also, as they defeated Shanghai and they move on, and they're on the road between Shanghai and Nanking, or Nanjing. Nanking is the capital city for modern day China. It was actually moved when they realized it was going to get sacked by the Japanese, but for all intents and purposes, it was the capital city. And the Japanese are marching there to take it over, and that's another thing that supposedly sets off the Japanese infantry, is they expected this to be a very quick war. They've been told that the Chinese stink at, warcraft, and that this is going to be, a summer campaign. This is going to be easy. It wasn't. And so they're marching up towards Nanking. The capital is moved, so now the war is going to be prolonged even longer, and supposedly that's another thing that angers the Japanese military men. On the road there, as a little side note and a side story, we get our first hint at some of the atrocities of the Japanese during this time. And that is a competition between two Japanese officers to see who could behead the most people on their way to Nanking. This was publicized in Japanese media, in newspapers, as if it was some kind of sporting event. And they were literally competing to see who could take the most heads off of people. Obviously, supposedly these were combatants, but they were also captured combatants. Their hands were tied behind their backs and they're being beheaded. And this competition goes on, and the goal originally was get to 100, and I don't remember the whole story and where it goes from there, but it kind of shows you the lack of empathy and the dehumanization that the Japanese had for the Chinese during this campaign. They get to Nanking. The resistance in Nanking is actually fairly light. Many things had been removed to the new capital elsewhere. And also, much of the resources had been put into the defense of Shanghai to prevent them from ever getting to the capital. So ultimately, Nanking did not have a lot of defenses. The city fell very quickly. I think it was a matter of a few days, like December 9th, 1937 to December 12th or 13th or something. The city fell very, very quickly. But there were a lot of soldiers in the capital, quite a few. The exact numbers are kind of hard and impossible to come by, but there were quite a few soldiers in the city. They just didn't have the supplies needed to fight off the Japanese. And so the Japanese take over Nanking, and this begins an event that has two popular names, either the Nanking Massacre or often known as the Rape of Nanking, because it did feature so many rapes of women of all ages. It is one of the most atrocious events in history that I've ever studied. And yes, that does include the Holocaust. I think there are parallels. Obviously, Holocaust is much larger. It was much larger in scope, and the things that were occurring were happening in much greater numbers. Purely on that, obviously, the Holocaust is much worse, but much of that same just horrific treatment and abuse of human rights is taking place during these few weeks in Nanking. The population in Nanking, after many people flee before the Japanese military gets there, is about 600,000 still. 600,000 people in this city. By the end of the Nanking Massacre, there are 300,000. Half of the city's population is decimated by this. Men are just rounded up because the Japanese say they don't know who is military and who is not military. So they round up most adult men that they can find, all the adult men that they can find of any kind of fighting age, and they tie them up and they take them out to fields. Some of them are burned, some of them are buried alive, some of them are tied to trees and used as target practice. Horrible, horrible treatment of these POWs under the Japanese here. And then we have the treatment of the citizens of the city itself. Obviously, another name for this, again, the rape of Nanking. The treatment of women of all ages, and I'm not going to get into too much detail on this because it is disturbing and just horrific. But the things that this involved were just absolutely disgusting behavior. Many of these women were assaulted and then killed afterwards, sometimes horrifically. Some of them were pregnant and while still alive had their babies removed from them after an assault where the baby was killed. There are certainly several stories similar to that. Just some of the worst abuses of human rights of anything you could ever look at. And again, there is worse things that I could get into in more detail, but I just don't want to. So, rape of Nanking, half of the city's population is dead. One of the great things about this story, though, is that there's actually a collection of European and American people who worked in Nanking at the time who decided to not flee. Most of them decided to leave. There were many Europeans and many Americans living in Nanking. It was the capital city of China. If you're doing trade and other things, you know, bankers and all kinds of people are living there. But some people decide to stay. And this group includes all kinds of people. One of the main leaders of this was a Nazi, and one of them was a woman who ran a school for girls, a Christian school for girls, a Christian missionary. Very different people with supporting very different sides of this whole thing, but ultimately they came together, and the 300,000 who did survive, one of the main reasons so many did actually make it out is because these Europeans that stayed, they put up European flags and American flags, and they decreed that this huge section of the city was the European safety zone, and that the Japanese weren't to come in there. They didn't have any authority to do that, but this did scare off the Japanese enough. They didn't want that bad press, and they didn't want to encourage other countries to join in efforts to fight them that they didn't have to. And so this effort actually was very, very successful, and a large portion of the city's population did survive inside that European safety zone. Most of those who survived this event, the Nanking Massacre, were saved inside that safety zone. So really, really incredible story. Ultimately, because of these events and other things going on, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he decides to cut off oil and steel exports to Japan. And this is a big blow to them because they do a lot of business with America, especially when it comes to oil. Ultimately, they come to the conclusion that they have something like 2 years left of oil supply before they start really feeling the squeeze of this. And so this supposedly pushes Japan farther into this imperialistic attitude and wanting to take over new territory for these resources that they are now gonna need to find elsewhere. One of these territories that they're wanting to take over is the Philippines, which, if you don't know, the Philippines had been a American territory during the time, and they initially didn't want to attack the Philippines because they knew it would dictate or demand a response from the U.S., so they avoided that initially, but ultimately they decided that that's something they want to do, and instead of attacking the Philippines and taking it over and fortifying it and waiting for the American response, their decision ultimately was to take the preemptive strike at Pearl Harbor, something that I hope most of you already know about. Pearl Harbor was the greatest attack on American soil in all of our history by a foreign power up until, the greatest, I shouldn't say the greatest attack, at least since the Revolutionary War anyway, the greatest attack in our nation's history, killing 2,400 people until 9/11, of course. And that's really all I have for you today. So one more time, I really hope you're enjoying your home study time, and I hope these videos are good for you and you are enjoying them. I think this is the best of a worst situation. Have a good one. Bye. I just wanted to remind you that this is supplementary to the notes. You still need to go through the notes and put those in your notebooks. But I hope this kind of helps give you a little summary. And I hope you guys are having a great home study time here. And I will see you again soon. Bye.
Let go of my shirt. Come on. Stay here.
Also, often colloquially, not even going to try to say that word again. I had this idea called the co-prosperity sphere. The co-prosperity sphere. The co-prosperity. The co-prosperity. They had this thing called the co-prosperity. Japan had this thing called the co-prosperity. In Japan, they had this idea called the co-prosperity sphere.